The gunshot echoed through the canyon, just as Ethan Zeller realized he had forgotten what another person's warmth felt like against his skin. He steadied his horse and peered down from the ridge at the overturned wagon below, where a woman in a torn blue dress struggled to free herself from beneath scattered crates and supplies. 3 men on horseback circled her like vultures, their laughter carrying up through the dry Arizona air. Ethan's jaw tightened as he urged his mare down the rocky slope, his hand already moving to the rifle strapped to his saddle. The descent took longer than he wanted, his horse picking carefully through the loose stones and scrub brush that dotted the hillside. By the time he reached the canyon floor, one of the men had dismounted and was grabbing at the woman's arm while she kicked at him fiercely. Ethan fired a warning shot into the air, and all 3 men spun toward him. "Lady's got business with you," Ethan called out, his voice steady and cold. The man holding the woman's arm released her and stepped back, his hand hovering near his pistol. "Ain't none of your concern, stranger. We found her first." "Found her." Ethan guided his horse closer, keeping his rifle balanced across his lap. "She looks like she needs help, not whatever you 3 are offering." The largest of the 3 men, a barrel-chested brute with a scar across his cheek, spat into the dirt. "You're outnumbered, Cowboy. Ride on before you get hurt." Ethan had faced worse odds. He had spent the last 7 years riding alone through territories where death came quick and mercy was scarce. His reputation as a tracker and sometime bounty hunter had spread through Arizona territory, though he never stayed anywhere long enough for people to know much else about him. He preferred it that way. People complicated things, and Ethan Zeller had learned that lesson the hard way. 3 against 1, Ethan said, his finger moving to the trigger. "But I only need 1 shot to make this fair." The tension hung heavy in the afternoon heat. The woman had scrambled to her feet and was backing away toward the canyon wall, her dark hair falling loose from its pins, her dress torn at the shoulder. Even from this distance, Ethan could see the determination in her face, the refusal to show fear despite the situation she had found herself in. The scarred man studied Ethan for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he jerked his head toward his companions. "Not worth it. Let's ride." They mounted up and galloped off, throwing dust and curses behind them. Ethan watched until they disappeared around the bend before he lowered his rifle and turned his attention to the woman. She stood pressed against the canyon wall, her chest heaving, her hands balled into fists at her sides. "You hurt?" Ethan asked, dismounting slowly so as not to startle her. "No." Her voice was steadier than he expected. "Thank you for your help." He nodded and walked over to examine the overturned wagon. The axle had snapped clean through, and the supplies scattered around suggested she had been traveling alone. Foolish, maybe, but Ethan knew better than most that people did foolish things when they had no other choice. "Where were you headed?" he asked, gathering up some of the scattered items. "Camp Verde." She moved away from the wall and began helping him collect the supplies. "I was supposed to arrive yesterday. I have a teaching position waiting for me there." "A schoolteacher." Ethan glanced at her, taking in the quality of her dress beneath the dirt and tears, the educated tone of her voice. She did not belong out here in the wild country, but then again, neither did most people who ended up here anyway. "Camp Verde's about 15 miles north," he said. "Your wagon's not going anywhere without repairs, and that'll take time you probably do not have." She looked at the broken wagon and then back at him, her green eyes assessing. "Could I hire you to take me there? I have some money." Ethan almost said no. He had been heading in the opposite direction, toward a job tracking a horse thief near Prescott. Taking her to Camp Verde would cost him 2 days at least, and he preferred traveling alone. He had preferred everything alone for 7 years now, ever since the fever had taken his wife and infant daughter in the winter of 1875. Since then, he had kept moving, never settling, never letting anyone close enough to matter. But he looked at this woman standing in the ruined remains of her journey, dirt on her face and determination in her eyes, and he found himself nodding. "Keep your money," he said. "But we need to leave now if we want to make it before dark. Can you ride?" "Yes." He helped her salvage what she could carry, which was not much. A carpet bag with clothes, a few books, and a small wooden box she held carefully. They loaded everything onto his horse, and then Ethan swung up into the saddle and reached down to pull her up behind him. The moment her hands gripped his waist, something shifted inside his chest. It was such a simple thing, such a basic human contact, but it had been so long since anyone had touched him that he felt it like a physical shock. She settled behind him, her body pressed against his back out of necessity rather than choice. Ethan tried to ignore the warmth of her, the way her hands felt through his shirt, but it was impossible. For 7 years he had been numb, moving through the world like a ghost, and now suddenly he was acutely aware of every breath, every small shift of her weight. They rode in silence for the first hour, following the canyon north before climbing up onto the plateau where the land opened into high desert scattered with juniper and mesquite. The sun beat down relentlessly, and Ethan could feel sweat trickling down his back where her hands rested. "I am Elena," she said finally, breaking the silence. "Elena Garrett, Ethan Zeller. You live in Camp Verde, Mr. Zeller." "No, just passing through." She was quiet for a moment. "Those men, do you think they will come back?" "No. Cowards like that only fight when they think they will win easy. You have seen a lot of fighting, I imagine." Ethan did not answer right away. The truth was complicated, and he had no desire to share it with a stranger. But she had asked an honest question, and something about her directness made him want to be honest in return. "Some," he said. "Enough to know when to fight and when to walk away. You did not walk away today." "No." Why not? He considered the question. Why had not he walked away? He had done it before, plenty of times. The world was full of people in trouble, and Ethan Zeller could not save them all. He had learned that lesson too, learned it when he could not save the 2 people who mattered most. "Because you needed help," he said simply. They stopped twice to rest the horse and drink from Ethan's canteen. During the second stop, Elena opened the wooden box she had salvaged from the wagon and showed him a daguerreotype of an older couple standing stiffly in front of a painted backdrop. "My parents," she explained. "They passed away last year within months of each other. My father first and then my mother. I think she just could not bear to be without him." Ethan understood that kind of grief. He handed the photograph back carefully. "You came all the way from where?" he asked. "Massachusetts." "Boston, specifically. Everything there reminded me of them, and I needed to start fresh somewhere new. When the teaching position in Camp Verde became available, it seemed like fate." "Camp Verde's rough country," Ethan warned. "Not much like Boston." "I know. But I am tougher than I look, Mr. Zeller." He believed her. Anyone who could face down 3 men with that kind of calm was not someone who scared easily. They reached Camp Verde just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The town was small, maybe 200 people, built along the banks of the Verde River where the water made the land green and fertile compared to the surrounding desert. There was a main street with the usual buildings, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and at the far end, a small schoolhouse with a bell tower. Ethan helped Elena down from the horse in front of the boarding house, a 2-story wooden structure that looked relatively well maintained. She stumbled slightly when her feet hit the ground, stiff from hours in the saddle, and he caught her elbow to steady her. "Thank you," she said, looking up at him, "for everything. I do not know what would have happened if you had not come along. You would have figured something out." She smiled at that, and Ethan felt something warm unfurl in his chest. It was a dangerous feeling, one he had spent 7 years avoiding. "Will you be staying in town?" she asked. "Just tonight. I have work near Prescott." Her smile faded slightly, but she nodded. "Well, thank you again, Mr. Zeller, truly." He touched the brim of his hat and turned to lead his horse away, but she called after him. "Ethan," he turned back, surprised she had used his first name. "If you are ever back this way, I hope you will let me thank you properly. Maybe dinner." He should have said no. He should have tipped his hat again and walked away, putting distance between himself and this woman who had somehow gotten under his skin in the space of a single afternoon. But instead, he found himself nodding. Maybe. Ethan stabled his horse and took a room at the boarding house, telling himself it was just convenient, that it had nothing to do with knowing Elena was somewhere in the same building. He ate dinner alone in the small restaurant attached to the boarding house, and then he sat on the porch watching the stars come out, smoking a cigarette and trying not to think about the warmth of her hands on his waist. He was still sitting there when she came out, wrapped in a shawl against the cooling night air. She paused when she saw him, and he thought she might go back inside, but instead she walked over and sat in the chair next to his. "Could not sleep?" she asked. "Not yet. You?" "Too much has happened today. My mind will not settle." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the town settling down for the night. A dog barked somewhere. Music drifted from the saloon down the street. The river murmured in the darkness beyond the buildings. "Can I ask you something?" Elena said finally. "Go ahead. Back in the canyon when you helped me, you looked like a man who was used to being alone, like maybe you preferred it that way. So why did you help?" Ethan took a long drag on his cigarette before answering. 7 years ago, I had a wife and a baby daughter. Fever took them both in the span of a week. After that, I could not stay in one place. Could not be around people. It hurt too much, all of it. So I started moving, taking jobs that kept me out in the wild country where I did not have to think or feel or remember. Elena was quiet, and when he glanced at her, he saw compassion in her eyes but not pity. He appreciated that. "I am so sorry," she said softly. "It was a long time ago." Grief does not care about time. He stubbed out his cigarette. "No, I suppose it does not. So what changed today? In the canyon?" Ethan turned the question over in his mind. What had changed? When he had seen those men circling her, something had cracked open inside him, some protective instinct he thought he had buried along with his family. "I do not know," he admitted. "Maybe I just got tired of walking away." Elena reached over and placed her hand on his arm, just a brief touch, but it sent electricity through him. "I am glad you did not walk away today." She stood to go inside, but Ethan found himself standing too, not ready for the conversation to end. They stood facing each other on the porch, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "Elena," he said, her name feeling strange and right on his tongue. "That dinner you mentioned, would tomorrow night be too soon?" Her face lit up with a smile that made his heart stutter. Tomorrow night would be perfect. Ethan did not ride out the next morning. He told himself he needed to check on his horse, that the animal needed another day of rest after carrying 2 people. But the truth was, he wanted to stay. He wanted to see Elena again, wanted to hear her voice and see that smile. It terrified him, this sudden need for another person's presence, but it also made him feel alive in a way he had not felt in 7 years. He spent the day helping the blacksmith repair some ranch equipment in exchange for having his saddle fixed, work that kept his hands busy but left his mind free to wander. He kept thinking about Elena, wondering what she was doing, if she was thinking about him too. It was like being a young man again. that nervous anticipation before seeing someone who mattered. That evening, he bathed and shaved carefully at the boarding house, putting on his cleanest shirt and running a comb through his hair. His reflection in the small mirror looked like a stranger, someone younger and more hopeful than the man who had ridden into Camp Verde the day before. Elena was waiting for him in the boarding house dining room, wearing a green dress that matched her eyes and brought color to her cheeks. Her dark hair was pinned up, revealing the graceful line of her neck, and Ethan found himself momentarily speechless. "You clean up nicely, Mr. Zeller," she said with a teasing smile. "So do you, Miss Garrett." They sat at a corner table, and over plates of roast chicken and potatoes, they talked. Elena told him about growing up in Boston, about her parents who had encouraged her education, about her love of books and teaching. Ethan found himself telling her things he had not spoken about in years. About growing up on a ranch in Texas, about learning to track from an Apache scout who had worked for his father, about the dreams he had once had before loss had stolen them away. "You could have those dreams again," Elena said, her eyes serious. "It is not too late." "I do not know if I remember how." "Then maybe you need to learn again." After dinner, they walked along the river in the moonlight, following a path that wound between cottonwood trees. The air was cool and sweet, filled with the sound of crickets and flowing water. Elena slipped her hand into his, and Ethan marveled at how natural it felt, how right. "I start teaching on Monday," she said. "I met with the town council this morning. They showed me the schoolhouse and my living quarters. It is small but adequate." "You nervous?" "A little. I have never taught in the West before. I imagine the children here are different from Boston children, probably more practical, less concerned with fancy manners." She laughed. "I can work with that." They stopped at a bend in the river where the moonlight reflected off the water in silver ripples. Elena turned to face him, and in that moment, Ethan knew he was in trouble. He had meant to keep his distance, to have dinner, and then ride out in the morning back to his solitary life. But looking at her now, feeling the warmth of her hand in his, he could not imagine leaving. "Elena, I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "I came here planning to leave tomorrow. I have work waiting and I never stay anywhere long. But being with you, talking to you, it makes me want to stay, and that scares me more than anything has in a long time." She squeezed his hand. "Why does it scare you?" "Because I cannot lose anyone else. I survived it once, barely. I could not do it again." Elena reached up and touched his face, her palm warm against his cheek. "Ethan, I lost both my parents. I know what grief feels like, how it can hollow you out until you are just going through the motions of living. But running from connection, from feeling anything, that is not living either. That is just a different kind of death. What if I am not strong enough? What if you are?" He pulled her close then, wrapping his arms around her, and she came willingly, pressing her face against his chest. The hug started as comfort, as reassurance, but it became something more. It became the first real human contact Ethan had allowed himself in 7 years, and the feeling of it overwhelmed him. Her warmth, her softness, the way she fit against him like she belonged there. His arms tightened around her, and he buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of lavender and sunshine. He did not want to let go. The thought of releasing her, of stepping back into that cold, solitary space he had occupied for so long, was suddenly unbearable. So he held on and she held him back, her arms wrapped around his waist, her heart beating against his. "I do not want to let go," he whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep inside him. "Then do not," she whispered back. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other under the stars while the river sang its endless song beside them. When they finally pulled apart, Ethan felt changed, like something frozen inside him had begun to thaw. "Stay," Elena said. Please, stay and see what happens." Ethan knew it was impulsive. He knew he should think it through, should consider all the risks and complications. But for once in 7 years, he did not want to think. He wanted to feel. He wanted to take the chance that maybe, just maybe, he could have something good again. "I will stay," he said. The smile that broke across her face was worth every risk. Ethan found work easily enough in Camp Verde. The town marshal, a weathered man named Jack Thornton, hired him as a deputy after hearing about his tracking skills. It was steady work, mostly dealing with cattle rustlers and the occasional drunk cowboy causing trouble. Nothing too dangerous, but enough to keep him occupied. He took a room above the general store, a small space with a bed, a table, and a window that looked out over the main street. It was not much, but it was more permanent than anywhere he had stayed in years. That fact alone should have sent him running, but instead, it gave him a strange sense of peace. Elena threw herself into teaching with a passion that amazed him. She had 18 students ranging from 6 to 15 years old, children of ranchers and shopkeepers and laborers. Ethan would sometimes stop by the schoolhouse during his rounds, standing in the doorway to watch her teach. She was patient and kind but firm when she needed to be, and the children responded to her with a respect that had to be earned out here. They fell into a routine. Ethan would finish his work in the late afternoon and walk Elena home from the schoolhouse. They would have dinner together, sometimes at the boarding house, sometimes at the small restaurant, sometimes just bread and cheese by the river. Then they would walk and talk until the stars came out, learning each other's stories, each other's dreams. Ethan felt himself opening up in ways he had forgotten were possible. Elena had a way of drawing him out, of making him want to share the parts of himself he had kept locked away. He told her about his daughter, Sarah, how she had his wife's laugh and his own stubborn chin. He told her about the ranch in Texas, where he had grown up, about his parents who had both passed while he was drifting through the territories. He told her about the guilt he carried, the feeling that he should have been able to save his family somehow, even though he knew logically that he could not have stopped the fever. Elena listened without judgment, her hand in his, her presence a quiet comfort. She shared her own griefs, her own fears. She told him about watching her mother fade away after her father died, about the helplessness of knowing there was nothing she could do to bring back the will to live in someone who had given up. She told him about the loneliness of being the last of her family, about coming west partly to escape that loneliness and partly to find something new. "I think we found each other," she said one night as they sat on the riverbank, her head resting on his shoulder. "I think you are right," Ethan agreed. 3 months after Elena arrived in Camp Verde, Ethan proposed. It was not a grand gesture, no elaborate planning. They were at their spot by the river, the same place where they had first held each other, and the words just came tumbling out. "Marry me," he said, turning to face her. "I know it is fast, and I know I am probably not the easiest man to be with, but I love you, Elena. I love you in a way I did not think I could love again." Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling. "Yes, yes, Ethan, I will marry you." He kissed her then, really kissed her for the first time, and it was like coming home after a long journey. Her lips were soft and warm, and she kissed him back with a passion that made his heart race. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Ethan felt complete in a way he had not felt since before the fever took his family. They were married a month later in the small church at the edge of town. Half of Camp Verde attended, including all of Elena's students who threw handfuls of wildflowers as they left the church. Ethan wore a new suit he had ordered from Prescott, and Elena wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself, her dark hair crowned with flowers. Marshal Thornton stood up as Ethan's best man, and the mayor's wife stood up for Elena. It was a simple ceremony, but it was theirs, and that made it perfect. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan kissed Elena with all the love and hope and promise he had thought he would never feel again. They moved into a small house on the outskirts of town, a two-room cabin with a porch that overlooked the river. It was not much, but Elena made it a home with curtains on the windows and flowers in jars on the table. Ethan added a rocking chair on the porch and fixed the fence around the small yard. At night, they would sit together on that porch, Elena reading aloud from one of her books while Ethan whittled or just listened to the sound of her voice. Life settled into a peaceful rhythm. Ethan continued his work as deputy marshal, and Elena continued teaching. They became part of the community, people who were known and trusted. Neighbors would wave when they passed, and children would call out greetings to Mrs. Zeller. It was the kind of life Ethan had once had and thought he would never have again. But it was different this time, better in some ways because he appreciated it more. He understood now how fragile happiness could be, how quickly it could be taken away. So he cherished every moment, every ordinary day, every quiet evening with Elena by his side. A year after their wedding, Elena told him she was pregnant. Ethan felt a surge of joy mixed with terror. He was going to be a father again, but the memory of losing Sarah haunted him. What if something went wrong? What if he lost Elena? The fears threatened to overwhelm him, but Elena took his hands and looked him in the eye. "We cannot live in fear of what might happen," she said firmly. "We can only live each day as it comes and trust that we are strong enough to face whatever happens together." "I am scared," he admitted. "So am I. But I am also excited and happy, and I am choosing to focus on that. Will you try to do the same?" He nodded, pulling her close. "I will try." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Ethan probably drove Elena crazy with his constant worrying. He made sure she did not lift anything heavy, that she ate well, that she rested enough. Elena tolerated his fussing with good humor, though she occasionally had to remind him that women had been having babies since the beginning of time, and she was perfectly capable of taking care of herself. The doctor in Camp Verde was an older man named Samuel Morrison, who had delivered half the children in town. He assured Ethan that Elena was healthy and strong, and that there was no reason to expect any complications. It helped ease Ethan's fears, though he knew he would not truly relax until the baby was born safe and healthy. Elena taught school until she was 7 months along, only stopping when climbing the schoolhouse steps became too difficult. The town found a temporary replacement teacher, a young man from Prescott, but everyone knew they were counting the days until Mrs. Zeller could return. On a warm night in September of 1883, Elena went into labor. Ethan rode through the darkness to fetch Dr. Morrison, while the mayor's wife, Martha, stayed with Elena. The labor lasted through the night and into the next morning, each hour feeling like an eternity to Ethan, who paced outside the bedroom door, listening to Elena's cries and feeling utterly helpless. Finally, just as the sun was rising, he heard the sharp wail of a baby. Dr. Morrison opened the door, his tired face breaking into a smile. "You have a son, Ethan. A big, healthy boy, and Elena did wonderfully." Ethan rushed into the room where Elena lay exhausted but radiant, holding a small bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "Meet our son," she said softly. Ethan knelt beside the bed and looked down at the tiny face peeking out from the blankets. The baby had a shock of dark hair and a scrunched-up face that was the most beautiful thing Ethan had ever seen. When the baby opened his eyes, they were the same green as Elena's. "He is perfect," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking. "You want to hold him?" Ethan hesitated. He had not held a baby since Sarah, had not let himself even think about it. But Elena was looking at him with such love and trust that he could not refuse. He took the baby carefully, supporting the small head the way he remembered, and felt the weight of his son in his arms. The baby yawned and made a small sound, and something in Ethan's heart that had been broken for so long finally healed. This was not a replacement for what he had lost. This was something new, something precious in its own right. He looked at Elena and saw his own joy reflected in her eyes. "What should we name him?" she asked. Ethan had been thinking about this for months. "I was thinking about Thomas, after my father, Thomas Zeller." Elena tried it out, smiling. "I like it. Thomas Ethan Zeller." Their son grew strong and healthy, a loud and demanding presence that filled their small house with life. Ethan marveled at every milestone, every smile, every small change. He would sit for hours just watching Thomas sleep, still amazed that this perfect little person was his. Elena returned to teaching when Thomas was 6 months old, and they worked out a system where Martha would watch the baby during school hours. Ethan would stop by at lunchtime to check on them, unable to stay away for too long. He knew he was probably being overprotective, but Elena understood. She knew his fears, knew what he had lost, and she gave him grace while gently pushing him to trust that this time would be different. As Thomas grew into a toddler and then a young boy, Ethan's fears gradually eased. He learned to let go a little, to trust that his family was not as fragile as he feared. Thomas was a sturdy child, curious and adventurous, always getting into things he should not. He had his mother's intelligence and his father's stubbornness, a combination that meant he kept them on their toes. Camp Verde grew too, becoming less rough around the edges. More families moved in, drawn by the good farming land and the promise of opportunity. The town added a proper schoolhouse with 2 rooms, and Elena taught the older children while a younger teacher handled the primary grades. The church expanded, and they built a small library that became Elena's pride and joy. Ethan moved from deputy to full marshal when Jack Thornton retired. It was more responsibility but less dangerous work, mostly organizing patrols and dealing with minor disputes. The wild lawlessness of the Old West was fading, giving way to something more civilized. Ethan was glad of it, glad that his son would grow up in a place that was becoming safer and more settled. When Thomas was 5 years old, Elena told Ethan she was pregnant again. This time, the news brought more joy than fear. Ethan had learned that he could not control everything, that worry would not protect the people he loved. All he could do was cherish each moment and trust that they would face whatever came together. Their daughter was born on a spring morning in 1888, coming into the world with a lusty cry that announced her presence to everyone within earshot. She had Ethan's dark eyes and Elena's delicate features, and from the moment he held her, Ethan was completely in love. "Catherine," Elena said, looking at their daughter. "After my mother." "Catherine Rose Zeller," Ethan added, remembering the wild roses that grew along the river. Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything. Ethan would find him sitting beside her cradle, talking to her in his serious little boy voice, telling her about his adventures and the things he was learning in school. Catherine would watch him with wide eyes, as if understanding every word. The years passed in a blur of ordinary happiness. Thomas grew tall and rangy like his father, learning to ride and track and handle himself in the wild country. Catherine grew into a bright, spirited girl who had her mother's love of learning and her father's determination. Ethan taught them both to shoot and ride, to raid the land and respect its dangers. Elena taught them to read and write and think critically, to question and wonder and dream. On quiet evenings, Ethan would sit on the porch with Elena, watching their children play in the yard, and feel a profound gratitude for the second chance he had been given. He thought sometimes about the man he had been when he rode into Camp Verde that day, solitary and closed off, convinced he could never open his heart again. That man seemed like a stranger now. "What are you thinking about?" Elena asked one evening, reaching over to take his hand. "About how lucky I am. About how different my life would be if you had not needed help that day," she smiled. "Maybe it was not luck, maybe it was meant to be." "You think so?" "I do. I think we were both lost, both running from our grief in different ways. And I think we found each other at exactly the right time." Ethan raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I love you, Elena Zeller." "I love you too, Ethan." When Thomas turned 18, he announced his intention to go to college in Tucson to study engineering. It was what Elena had been preparing him for, encouraging his natural curiosity and his love of building things. Ethan was proud, though a part of him mourned the passage of time, the fact that his little boy was becoming a man. Catherine, at 13, was already talking about becoming a teacher like her mother. She spent hours at the schoolhouse, helping Elena grade papers and prepare lessons. Ethan could see Elena's influence in everything she did, the way she spoke, the way she thought about the world. It made him smile. Life was not always easy. There were droughts that tested the ranchers, illnesses that swept through town, the occasional conflict that required Ethan's intervention as marshal. But they faced everything together, as a family and as a community. The bonds they had built sustained them through the hard times and made the good times sweeter. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Ethan took Elena back to the spot by the river where he had first held her, where he had realized he did not want to let go. The town had grown up around them, but this place remained unchanged, still wild and beautiful. "You remember?" he asked, pulling her close. "Of course I remember. How could I forget? I was so scared that night, scared of feeling anything, scared of losing anyone else, but you made me brave." Elena looked up at him, her green eyes still as bright as the day he met her. "You made yourself brave, Ethan. You chose to take the risk, to open your heart again. I just gave you a reason to try." He kissed her then, long and deep, still amazed after 20 years that he got to call this incredible woman his wife. When they pulled apart, they stood wrapped in each other's arms, watching the river flow past, listening to the familiar sounds of the desert evening. "Thank you," Ethan said softly. "For what? For hugging me that night, for not letting me stay closed off and alone, for giving me a reason to live again instead of just existing." Elena tightened her arms around him. "Thank you for not letting go." As the sun set over Camp Verde, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Ethan held his wife and thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The loss and grief, the loneliness and fear, the tentative first steps back toward connection and love. It had not been easy, and there had been moments when he wanted to give up, to retreat back into the safety of solitude. But Elena had shown him that safety was an illusion, that the only way to truly live was to risk being hurt, to open yourself up to love even knowing it could be taken away. She had taught him that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. The years continued to pass, marked by milestones and memories. Thomas graduated from college and returned to Camp Verde to work on expanding the town's infrastructure, bringing modern engineering to the growing community. He married a young woman from Prescott, a doctor's daughter named Sarah, and the fact that Ethan could hear his first daughter's name without pain was a testament to how much he had healed. Catherine did become a teacher, taking over Elena's position when Elena finally retired at 62. She was every bit as good as her mother, bringing the same passion and dedication to educating the next generation. She married later than her brother, choosing a quiet rancher named James who adored her completely. Ethan retired as marshal at 65, handing the job over to a younger man, while he spent his days helping Thomas with various projects around town and spoiling his growing number of grandchildren. Thomas and Sarah had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. Catherine and James had 2 daughters who were as spirited and determined as their mother. Elena continued her work with the library, expanding it into one of the finest collections in the territory. She organized reading groups and literary societies, bringing culture and education to Camp Verde in ways that transformed the community. Ethan would sometimes find her there in the afternoons, surrounded by books and children, reading aloud with the same enthusiasm she had shown in their early days together. On warm evenings, they would still walk down to their spot by the river, moving more slowly now but together still. They would sit on the bench Ethan had built there years ago and watch the water flow past, holding hands and talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes their children would join them, and then their grandchildren, whole family gatherings by the riverside where stories were told and laughter rang out across the water. As they grew older, Ethan found himself thinking more about those early days, about the broken man who had ridden into Camp Verde thinking he would never open his heart again. He was grateful every day that he had been wrong, that he had found the courage to try again, to let Elena in. She had given him back his life, had shown him that it was possible to heal and love and build something beautiful from the ashes of loss. On the morning of their 40th anniversary, Ethan woke early and watched Elena sleep beside him. Her dark hair was streaked with silver now, and there were lines on her face that had not been there when they met. But to him, she was as beautiful as ever. More beautiful, maybe, because of all the years and experiences they had shared. She opened her eyes and caught him watching, a smile spreading across her face. "Good morning, husband. Good morning, wife. Happy anniversary, 40 years. Can you believe it? Some days it feels like longer. Some days it feels like we just met yesterday." She reached over and took his hand, their fingers intertwining automatically. "Do you ever regret staying, giving up the life you had before?" Ethan did not even have to think about it. "Not for a single second. You gave me everything, Elena. You gave me a home and a family and a reason to believe in happiness again. How could I ever regret that? You gave me the same things. I was so alone when I came here, running from my grief and trying to convince myself I was starting fresh. But I was just hiding, same as you. Then you saved me, and you kept saving me every day after that just by being you." They spent the day surrounded by family, children and grandchildren crowding into their house and spilling out into the yard. There was food and music and laughter, the kind of celebration that only comes from a life well lived and thoroughly shared. Ethan looked around at the faces of the people he loved, the family he and Elena had built together, and felt a profound sense of completion. As evening fell and the guests began to drift away, Ethan and Elena walked down to the river one more time. The path was so familiar now that they could have walked it in their sleep, every rock and tree a old friend. They sat on their bench and watched the sunset, just as they had done thousands of times before. "I had a good life," Ethan said quietly. "Even before I met you there were good times, but this life, the one we built together, this is the life I was meant to have." Elena leaned her head on his shoulder. "Do you remember that first night when I hugged you and you did not want to let go? I remember everything about that night. I did not want to let go either. I knew then, somehow, that you were special, that we were going to be important to each other." "You were right." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. The river murmured its eternal song, and somewhere in the distance, An owl called out into the night. It was peaceful and perfect, a moment of pure contentment. "Promise me something," Elena said. "Anything. Promise me that if I go first, you will not shut yourself away again. You will stay connected to our family, to the life we built. You will keep living, really living, not just going through the motions." Ethan felt a tightness in his chest, not wanting to think about a time when Elena would not be beside him. But he understood why she was asking. She knew his history, knew how he had responded to loss before. "I promise," he said, "and you have to promise me the same thing. I promise." They sealed their promises with a kiss, and then they sat together under the stars, holding each other the way they had that first night 40 years ago. The moment stretched out, precious and perfect, a culmination of decades of love and commitment and choosing each other every single day. The years that followed were gentler, slower. Ethan and Elena spent their days in quiet companionship, reading together, working in their garden, visiting with family. They celebrated birthdays and holidays, welcomed new great-grandchildren, and watched their legacy grow and flourish in the community they had helped build. Ethan never forgot the promise he had made, and as they aged, he made sure they both kept living fully, kept engaging with the world around them. They traveled to Tucson to visit Thomas and his family, making the journey by train now instead of horseback. They attended Catherine's book club meetings and theatrical performances at the town hall. They babysat great-grandchildren and told stories of the old days when Camp Verde was just a rough frontier town and life was harder, but somehow simpler. As they approached their 50th anniversary, the whole town began planning a celebration. Camp Verde had grown into a proper city now, with paved streets and electric lights, but it still remembered its roots and the people who had helped build it into something special. Ethan and Elena Zeller were part of that history, respected and beloved by multiple generations. The celebration was held in the town square on a beautiful May evening. There were speeches and tributes, people sharing stories about how the Zellers had touched their lives. Former students of Elena's spoke about how she had opened their minds and encouraged their dreams. People Ethan had helped as Marshall talked about his fairness and integrity. It was overwhelming and beautiful, seeing the impact they had made simply by living their lives with kindness and purpose. When it was Ethan's turn to speak, he stood before the crowd with Elena beside him, her hand in his. He looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some belonging to generations that had come after, and felt a swell of emotion. 50 years ago, I rode into Camp Verde planning to stay just one night. I was running from grief and loss, convinced I would never open my heart to anyone again. Then I met Elena, and everything changed. She showed me that love was worth the risk, that connection was worth the pain it might bring. She taught me how to live again, really live, not just survive. These 50 years with her have been the greatest gift of my life, and I thank God every day that I was in the right place at the right time to help her when she needed it. Because in helping her, she saved me. The crowd erupted in applause, and Elena stood to kiss him, tears streaming down both their faces. The celebration continued long into the night, with music and dancing and joy. Ethan danced with Elena under the stars, moving slowly but together still, and he marveled at how a life could change in a single moment, how one decision to help instead of walk away had led to all of this. They lived several more years in contentment and peace, watching their great-grandchildren grow, seeing Camp Verde continue to evolve and thrive. When Elena finally passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 79, Ethan grieved deeply but did not break. He kept his promise to her, staying connected to their family, continuing to engage with the community they had built together. He would go down to the river often, to the spot where they had shared so many moments over the decades. He would sit on the bench and talk to her, telling her about the children and grandchildren, sharing the news of the town. Sometimes he would close his eyes and remember the feel of her in his arms that first night, the way she had hugged him, and he had not wanted to let go. He could still feel her warmth, still hear her voice, still sense her presence in everything around him. Ethan Zeller lived to be 84 years old, surrounded by the family he and Elena had created together. When he passed away on a quiet autumn morning, his children and grandchildren gathered around him, holding his hands and telling him it was okay to go, that Elena was waiting for him. His last thought was of her smile, of the way she had looked at him that first night by the river when he had admitted he did not want to let go. And as he took his final breath, he felt her arms around him once more, welcoming him home. They buried him beside Elena in the cemetery, overlooking the Verd River, under a large cottonwood tree that had witnessed decades of the town's history. The whole community turned out for the funeral, paying respects to a man who had helped shape their world simply by choosing love over fear, connection over isolation. On the shared headstone, their children inscribed words that captured the essence of their parents' love story. Together they built a life. Together they rest. And below that, dates marking their births, their marriage, and their deaths. A timeline of a love that had transformed two broken people into something whole and beautiful. Years later, their great-great-grandchildren would visit that grave and ask about Ethan and Elena, wanting to hear the stories. And their descendants would tell them about the solitary cowboy who had forgotten what human warmth felt like, and the brave schoolteacher who had reminded him. They would tell about a hug that changed everything, about a man who did not want to let go, and a woman who held on just as tight. They would tell about love that healed old wounds and created new joy, about a partnership that lasted 53 years and created a legacy that would endure for generations. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light was just right, people walking along the river would swear they could see two figures sitting on the old bench under the cottonwood trees, holding hands and watching the water flow past, together still in the place where their love story had truly begun.